Hey, Trevor, Tommy here, professor of the course. Great to have you in the course, man. And thank you for the good work you did in both of the response forums here in week one. Want to send you a video reply, gives me a chance to say hello a little more directly, and also kind of get our conversation off on a good footing, I hope. And then also give you a little bit of feedback on what you've written, which, as I've said, is really good. I'm glad already that you're kind of retaining your own voice and not just reproducing what a source says, but then engaging it critically with which is what you do with Taubes. And then I think you note some of the difficulties of a messianic sort of interpretation of Paul's quotation of Habakkuk. So keep that up, man. That's exactly what we want. And I think the critical kind of points you're raising are very good in both cases. So thank you for that good work. Um, I think I want to start by just underscoring maybe the the issue that you have raised in the treatment of the quotation of Habakkuk 2:4 as uh, sort of meant in the flow of the letter as about the Messiah. I think that you're right that if that were clearly the only or primary thing that Paul wants to say, he sure could have made that a little bit clearer. We don't know which version of the Septuagint Paul was using. The manuscript tradition of that is not entirely stable. So it's hard to say, this is what Paul did with Paul's source because we don't know what Paul's source was exactly. And it also seems to be the case that in quoting the scriptures of the Septuagint, writers, Paul including others, felt some freedom to phrase things in a way that fit the immediate context that they were addressing in whatever letter they're writing. So, all that to say, I think you're right that it feels like a little bit of a stretch to reduce the force of that quotation in Romans 1 to a reference to the Messiah. On the other hand, I think what I would say is that the the prophets, including Habakkuk, the law as well, are, you might say, open to a kind of messianic horizon. And so it's not a matter of, whether or not this or that fragment is some hidden messianic prophecy. It is that the vision of Israel's life, of its future, is finally messianic and therefore open to certain kinds of reception depending on what God does with Israel's life in relation to other peoples and what that does to the meaning of the words as they live over generations. So, my sense is based on how Paul develops this word from the thesis throughout the letter, is that he does not mean to reduce the meaning of Habakkuk 2:4 to something about the Messiah, but he does seek, I think, to, you might say, harness its ambiguity and its messianic horizon so as to show how it resonates with the life of the Messiah as it has actually unfolded. It still needs to mean something, though, right? In the immediate context of Habakkuk. And I don't think we want to lose sight of that. And that's where I think what you've said about some of the just clear context of Habakkuk as we just read the prophecy is important. Habakkuk is complaining to God. Habakkuk is outraged at what God, the God of Israel, has allowed to befall God's people at the hands of very cruel enemies, the Chaldeans. And so, what faith means needs to land in that sort of a context, I think. And of course, if we kind of cue to what the flow of the prophecy is saying there in chapter 2. It seems to be that um, faith is an alternative to the pride, the arrogance, the exploitative and oppressive mentality that so much of Israel's life is immersed in. It's conditions that tempt them to be cynical, to give up, to think that there's nothing worth being just for, that they just have to cave to a kind of dog eat dog world. And Habakkuk channels the word of the Lord that know that the just by faith will live. And faith then means being able in those difficult circumstances to trust God, to act in a way that relies upon God to provide rather than sort of exploiting the weak or reacting cynically without any view to the consequences of how we treat one another. This is sort of the theater in which I think faith makes sense. And I would want to highlight there in a way that few of the commentators do. Bart is an exception here, and I think a welcome one. And that is that the faith of God is in view here, which is, of course, I think what the Septuagint is emphasizing. And it's in view because the faith of the human, the faith of the just one, is possible only based on the faith of God, that God will act in good faith, that God is trustworthy, faith worthy. So there is no faith of the just apart from the faith of God, the faithfulness of God. And that's how I think we should understand what Paul says about the justice of God being revealed from faith to faith, from the faith of God to the faith of the human, which is the fruit of the faith of God on the ground in the life of the people of God. And of course, this is, if we pursue that messianic horizon, a movement of God's justice that reaches its fullness in the person of Jesus, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one. Paul has described the Messiah as the Son, the heir of God, the human one in whom God invests all of God's own ruling power, God's own future. And that's where the faith of God and the faith of the human unfold. And of course, what the letter, I think, is emphasizing is that this is a faith that is contagious. It spreads. It spreads by the spirit of the risen Messiah. It is the presence of his life that is infectious and incorporates other people into it by baptism. So that faith then is going to play out in certain ways that Paul wants to teach the Roman audience in the way that they treat one another, the way that they negotiate all kinds of difficulties and tensions with one another. The faith that has claimed them empowers them to treat one another with the same love with which God has treated them. And so that, I think, sort of frames what the force of the letter will be. Turning to the second response forum, I I share, like, I think a little bit of your suspicion, when you start reading these days about someone claiming something that is political, because you're right, very quickly people seem to traffic in all kinds of anachronism and assumptions, um, as if, the political context that Paul is writing from, that Paul is writing to, is indistinguishable from, say, a political context like ours here in a society like that of the US in our day. And there are, as you're, I think, rightly saying, a lot of important differences. So that to throw that term around loosely is usually to equivocate, oversimplify, etc. But I was glad to see that I think, charitably found Taubus's use of the political, or way of describing the political, to hold some water. And I agree with that. I think that it's important to recognize that Jesus did pose enough of a political threat to get himself executed by the Roman authority in um, the eastern province of the Empire of Judea. And this is actually how we find Roman historians like Tacitus describing Jesus as someone who uh, bore the maximum penalty, the penalty for sedition. And that was, of course, the charge under which Jesus was executed, pretending to be the king of the Jews, when in fact Rome claims the kingdom over the Jews. So, the movement associated with Jesus is going to have a kind of political uh, dynamic to it. But we have to sort of be patient, I think, to get at what that actually is, rather than assuming that what passes as political in our context would neatly match what Paul is saying or teaching to the audience that he's addressing the most directly. Um, Politics in our context often has to do with elections, with um, representatives, with offices, with jurisdictions of power, and very few of those kinds of things are in place. And yet there is still a kind of structure to power, to rule, to government. And where I think we need to locate the sort of political edge of Paul's gospel is in communities of people that are embodying the rule of Jesus in the way that they treat one another, in the way that they handle their possessions, their goods, share their tables, their time with each other. They do embody a kind of political reality, a certain kind of community in the world. And so that's different, though, right, from imagining something as political because it is, um, simply kind of thrown at the oppressive power as a rhetorical threat. I don't think the political significance of Paul's gospel is primarily in its rhetorical effect on a sort of, say, an audience of the Roman government. It has more to do with the way that it's feeding a certain way of being human, a certain kind of community in the world. Um, so in that sense, I think you're right that the claim by Taubes that Romans is a declaration of war on Caesar could be an overstatement, partly because Paul's not writing this to Rome. Um, Paul's writing this to an audience of Gentile people in Rome who are serving Jesus as Lord and therefore not the Caesar. And whether that constitutes a declaration of war, I think, is a kind of open question. Um, it is worth just pondering how Rome, I think you go on to say actually here that the Romans may have seen this as a declaration of war, but for Paul, you're saying it wasn't. I think we just have to sort of unpack what we mean by declaration of war. I think you're right that Paul is not sort of arming a militia that is going to march into the sort of forum and attempt to seize kind of territorial sovereignty by violence and claim the government for themselves. That's not Paul's vision. In fact, part of what Eliot, I think, is at pains to try to hold together is how this is an anti-imperial message that includes an urging of people to be subject to imperial authorities at the same time. So we have to nuance what we mean by the way Paul's gospel opposes the Roman Empire. And if I had to summarize it, I would say that it does announce the doom of the Roman Empire insofar as it constitutes an oppressive and unjust rule. But it trusts God to bring about that demise rather than trying to engineer that demise itself. And it is a witness to the future that will have endured through that demise, which is the witness of the community of people that is serving Jesus as Lord, who has risen from among the dead endures the rise and fall of different uh, kingdoms and empires of the world and continues to claim people as his followers. So I don't think that means sort of passively submitting to bad government, but it means that how uh, disciples of Jesus oppose bad government as part of their witness to the gospel. And that's something we always, or I think we have to just try to reflect on together and think through, especially in the particular circumstances where we're trying to express that sort of faithful witness to the gospel. Anyway, as I said at the beginning, thanks for some really thoughtful, I think, engagement with the material, and looking forward to more conversation with you throughout the rest of the term. You're welcome to reply to this video with anything that you want. No pressure to do that, though. If you don't write anything by way of reply or whatever, if you don't mind at least giving me a one-word received or something along those lines, just so that I know that the video came through and that you were able to see it. Thanks again, Trevor, for some good work. Looking forward to working through Romans with you this summer.